The flames. History's greatest secret and key to a future where ships travel lifetimes to bring flames to new worlds. Those who dare to walk the fire can cross between the stars with a step if you can find a ferryman and pay your way across. For most who brave the flame alone are lost forever. May the ferryman take you. Crucible and Flame 4.
Scat you!
The ferryman looked up from the steaming cup in his hands, just in time to see child-sized sets of heads and arms duck out of the church doorway, screaming and laughing gleefully as they turned tail and ran. "Burn brightly, Tender Cable," one of the children shrieked. "Burn brightly, Deva," the other squealed. Tender Cable chuckled and watched out the open door as the laughter and footfalls faded away. A contented smile on his face, he pulled the heavy wooden doors closed. Fire from the braziers placed in each of the church's 4 corners were the only light. Dancing shadows flickered behind the tender as he filled a cup from a stone teapot and carefully placed the pot back on a serving tray atop the table beside the door. Cup in hand, he turned to the ferryman, who still leaned against the back of the first pew. The tender's gentle smile fixed on him. "Have some tea, friend. You look like shit." The ferryman lifted the cup automatically and drank. He'd swallowed the first mouthful before the bitter taste hit him. "Terrible," he grunted and pushed the cup out for the tender to take. The tender did not take it. He only laughed. "Drink." The ferryman's eyes widened. He stared at the happy tender standing in the Church of the Flame where he tended his flock, who still made no move to obediently jump at a ferryman's whim. Silence stretched while the tender continued to watch and smile. The ferryman pulled back his hand and stared in the cup. He angled it to catch light from the nearest brazier. His nose wrinkled in disgust. "It's green." "It's matcha. It's very good for you," the tender clucked and finally took the cup. He took a sip and sighed. "Antioxidants, vitamins, blah, blah, blah. You start to like the taste." He handed the cup back. Exhausted, the ferryman took it and drank. The tender nodded and turned back to the table near the door. He collected a tin and a rag from the tabletop and knelt beside it. "I understand you'll be staying with me for a while." In the half-light of the church, alone with the tender, his tattooed cheek didn't burn, and the shame of the clothes was less. He struggled to hold on to feeling anything other than tired now. He stared at the tender who dipped the rag into the tin and rubbed it against the side of the table. "Can't you make one of your flock do that? I want out of these clothes. There's a room prepared for me, yes?" The tender ignored the ferryman, continuing to rub the cloth on the side of the table. He hummed something under his breath. "Show me to my room, please. After you drink your tea, and after I finish this panel. If you don't treat wood, if you leave it exposed to the air too long, it shows its age fast." The man chuckled. "Kind of like you." Angered, the ferryman pushed off the back of the pew now and turned. He paced to the end of the row. The church didn't even have an aisle to pace up, just the one row of pews, a dozen deep. He drank his tea and paced, gingerly, so as not to aggravate his blisters, but it still let him work up a head of steam. Was everyone aboard Ship 227 in on a joke to show him up? He walked to the far corner, close enough to the tall, heavy iron brazier to feel its heat on his face. He didn't feel the flame inside, though. He stepped closer, the heat growing searing hot. No, this flame was cold where it mattered, just a chemical reaction, not a pathway. Why so many in the church kept flames outside their sacred houses, he'd never understand. The ferryman walked along one side of the pews, up to the red and orange fringed altar and back down the far side of the pews. The tender continued to hum and treat the wooden table. He finished his cup and dropped it on the corner of the table. The tender looked up. The ferryman opened his mouth to ask for his room again, but stopped when he faced raised eyebrows. It took a moment for his lack of common courtesy to sink in. Then, with a start, the ferryman grabbed the cup and placed it next to the teapot on the serving tray. Tender Cable nodded, wiped away the wet circle with his cloth, and bent to his work again. "What is it, your local word for firewalker?" The tender rubbed 2 fingers over the darkened wood panel and nodded. "Better." He stood, folding his cloth and collecting the tin of protectant. Only then did he meet the ferryman's eyes. "Oh, yes, that," he chuckled. "Sorry, I'm something of a Buddhist, and the children like to hear the stories." The ferryman barked out a laugh of surprise, but the tender just kept talking. "Buddhists figure we're all born again, and our karma in each life determines the form we take in our next, raising ourselves up or sliding back down." He opened a door in the side of the table and secreted the cloth and tin away. "Narakas lead the most miserable, hellish existences. Then it gets better from there. Souls can raise up into hungry ghosts, animals, humans, demigods, and finally devas, godly spirits." The ferryman stared. "The children have called your kind devas ever since I broke down and told them about the cycle." The tender leaned in. "Although to me, you look a darn sight closer to the miserable Naraka end of the spectrum." He realized the man was serious. "You're a tender of the Church of Flame and a Buddhist? How can a tender believe in reincarnation?" "Isn't that what happens when you walk the fire?" the other asked, a twinkle in his eye. "Doesn't matter what anyone believes anyways, ferryman. Just what you believe. You might do well to think on it. All right, let's get you set up in my room." The ferryman followed, stunned by the man's presumption. How dare the man ask what he believes? Then he caught the words. "There is no room prepared for me? Didn't expect you to show," Tender Cable called over his shoulder. "Your kind always stays up front." The ferryman opened his mouth to show that he would do just that, to command the tender make the arrangements, when he remembered the legal's words again. Women, fresh and green. Then he felt insulted, demeaned that the tender expected that of him. Then he asked himself why. Why the hell he was thinking and feeling any of what he was thinking or feeling. He'd been on the verge of collapse when the tender found him. He knew he wasn't going anywhere tonight. And when he looked at the clothes he ached to be rid of, though out of the sight of all but the tender the ache was less, he thought of the cycle he'd been on himself since his arrival on Ship 227. Boredom, embarrassment, anger, shame, exhaustion. He'd lost the thread completely. He took a deep breath to call the tender back and realized his head felt clear for the first time since he'd stepped through the flame, his energy levels buoyed by the hot drink. The matcha stuff was keeping him on his feet, and since he'd set foot in the church he'd been alternately annoyed and dumbfounded, but no longer steeping in ugly, churning emotions at least. No doubt the tender's room would be a hovel beneath him, he thought automatically, then laughed again. Legal Critchlow was forcing all of 227 to his whim and bathing in luxury, finery, and their submission. That was not what he wanted. The back of his head tingled as his busy mind collided with his body's exhaustion. "Ready when you are, ferryman." He looked up again. The tender was standing on the raised platform at the front of the church. There was a door at the back, no doubt leading to his personal quarters beyond it. "You know what I am." Surprising himself, the ferryman picked at his clothes to fill his words with meaning. "You know what I am. I was condemned to die. I was nothing before I stepped through, before I became a ferryman." He tapped the lines of pigment numbers on his cheek. "Is this why I'm nothing? Why I'm Narakas?" Tender Cable crossed back to the ferryman. "Clothes don't make you. Not rags and not the finest. Scars don't make you." Cable pulled the cloak back and put his hand on the filthy stained cheek beneath. "Not this branding, and not how the flame burns you. It's what you do. and what you believe that determines if your life is low or high, heaven or hell, the tender said, kindness and concern shaping his face. I call you Narakas because for you, this life we share is hell. The ferryman was frozen by the man's perception and by the man's kindness. You'd do well to think on it, the tender repeated. After a good night's sleep. The tender's face transformed into another smile. He clapped a hand on the ferryman's arm, dragged him up onto the altar, and through the door beyond. Walk the Fire by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Theme music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Many of the stories you listen to at servingworlds.com were made possible by the support of patrons at patreon.com/servingworlds. If you like what you hear, please consider adding your support. Thank you for listening.